Historians all over the United States know Ernst Breisach for the work that he did, the training that they received from him. So not only people here in classes here at Western Michigan University, but a very wide group of people. So Ernst, we're delighted now to hear you talk about your life and work as a historian.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. In fall 1941, I entered the University of Vienna as a student, full of enthusiasm, very happy that I had the rigorous and tightly planned university preparatory school behind me, looked forward to the freedom of inquiry, and wasn't disappointed. My special interest was history. That was nurtured by about 8 years of history twice a week in preparatory school, and 7 years of Latin twice a week. Latin because we read many texts of historical character. My love for history was also further fostered by the small town in Styria in which I grew up with the name of Judenburg, which itself is interesting, means the castle of the Jews, and the reason for that is because in 1250 they founded a city, a small group of Jewish merchants. You walked through the town, and you probably walked by historical buildings because you didn't pay any attention. Daily you saw them. But you could see on the slope of the mountain the ruins of a medieval castle of the family of the Liechtenstein. You saw one apartment house we lived in was next to the remains of a late medieval city gate. You could go to church if you wanted to in a church from the 1400s. You could visit the city hall, and part of that was beautiful architecture of the Renaissance. And of course, you couldn't overlook the city tower, about 200 feet, seen from every place in the valley, which was built in the time of Martin Luther. So I learned a lot of history. I was fascinated. The impression, however, which I had was of a very gently flowing human life, and one can be overawed by it. One can just simply trust it. It was ordered. That clashed violently with the experience which was described in the early part of this program. It was such a clash that I looked for history to tell me something. What sense does this make? One, I wasn't very successful. First of all, I didn't know enough history. And secondly, I had too simple an idea about history. But that's what it was. A clash which, in a sense, stayed with me, and the life and then its representation in history, how this comes about, a fascinating problem. One, I had some help in believing that history and life were connected. In Latin class, we used to somebody started reading a section from works, and then the other one had to translate it. So it rotated. And as I was sitting there, we were reading selection from the work by Cicero, and about the oratore, about the orator. And suddenly my attention span at least doubled. It was a quote, and I'll read it to you. History, the witness to ages past, light of truth, life giver to memory, And now notice, teacher of life. That caught my attention. Herald of ages past, by whose voice, but that the orators, is it bequeathed to immortality. Well, there's three parts to this. One is history true, telling about ages past. Teacher of life, and comes this very obscure phrase at the end. We'll dig it out later on in the talk. But right now, teacher of life. That's what impressed me enormously. And after all, who was I? A little student in a preparatory school. But here was a man who was famous telling you that. It's the teacher of life. So with that equipment, I went to the university and hoping to get answers. But the answers were slow in coming. But I had my first experience with a systematic inquiry into history. And interestingly enough, Professor Barclay mentioned that school of history, historicism. If you think of history portraying life, there is a whole spectrum. You can be very close to life. Local history, for instance. Your granduncle might appear in there. And then on the other end is world history. Very abstract, very remote from life, in a sense, because they have different purposes. And historicism stayed on the close to life side. It looked at history and saw entities, states, empires, societies. And they did not start to make generalization over any of them, but the idea was that each of these entities had a life of its own, was unique. See, the uniqueness part disappears very quickly in the generalization of history. But historicism stayed very close to that. So the idea was to find, in German was called der Deutsche Geist, the German spirit, formed the German culture. And it is so unique. It will not be exportable. You really can generalize, taking the French spirit and the German spirit and the Russian spirit, somehow make a unit out of it. It was very much representative of the nation state, where the nation the nations existed separately and were not over, there was no bracket to get them together. At least the historicism I was taught. My professors didn't tell me, and I have suspicion they didn't know. They didn't study history of historiography. That in the late 18th century, when the historicism started, there was a biblical God who created all these units, and therefore they had a unit, whatever it was. But the moment in 1880s, when the history wanted to become a science, God was kind of ushered out because it didn't fit in that scheme. At that moment, historicism fell apart into a very clear relativism. And relativism would be held against it after 1945. My professors enjoyed it because whenever there was an ideological interference, they said, we can't do that. We have to study things as they were, from inside out. We cannot bring anything from the present in there. So therefore, all this cannot be done. What you want me to do, okay? So I should have been wise enough when I got my methods course. The methods I studied were supposedly universally valid. Well, how does that work? That's a contradiction. Well, nothing of that was settled. This semester ended, I got my draft notice. That was a kind of a dark cloud over my head anyhow. So, and about not quite 2 years later, I resumed my studies. I had considerably matured. I was with the German army in Russia, and as I explained before, I was wounded, and the experience has certainly transformed me. And then, the moment I could go on 2 crutches, I asked for permission to study, and the army granted me that. So I could study throughout the rest of the war, because I was in the hospitals until about the beginning of 1945. So I was educated. I had fine professors, excellent professors. I can give them a clean bill of health, no indoctrination whatsoever. But my questions wasn't answered, except life kept piling on experiences, make it even more difficult. The air raids, which I mentioned. Then the period without order, which I also mentioned before. And enormous education in thinking about humans and what human beings are and what they do. Then the occupation by the Soviet Union, and then the starvation following. All of this, of course, left no time for much contemplation or meditation or whatever you want to do. Then I went to, started working, taught, first one full-time job, then another half-time glued to it, studying for a second PhD. I was really in no shape to think much about how we can come to some conclusion in my thinking. Then, in the 1st of January '53, Herman and I landed in Hoboken, and I was in the United States. That meant a considerable transition, cultural transition. But it suddenly became quiet around me. It was a wonderful experience. And I could think, well, I had to sort things out. And partially because I had a German upbringing, a German cultural upbringing, partially because I'm inclined that way, I did not go and started to look for a new method to study history, but I wanted to, went and examined what I was thinking about the world, how I was thinking. In short, the very basis of the historian, when the historian examines him or herself, that's where really the decisive influence comes from. I studied philosophy when I was studying history, but I didn't turn to the philosophy which I learned. I turned to some, at that time, very fashionable philosophy, existentialism, studied it carefully, found that what it really told me was, differently from the traditional philosophy, that a human being comes into the world which is a stranger to that being. It's not something a smooth landing, so to speak. My experiences would say that's not exactly what I experienced. And existentialism told me that this is what your situation is. You have to now confront that very strange world and make sense out of it. Not do by yourself, but you must lead a life which, Seneca said it, an unexamined life is not worth living. And I think the existentialists said it differently in the fact that you have to lead an authentic life, a life which you have thought through. That stuck with me, but unfortunately, existentialism wasn't very much used in history, because the existentialists look down at history as a secondary tale. It's too far away from real life. And secondly, too much, and by osmosis, breathes in too many explanations, which you should really work out yourself. So I wrote my book on existentialism and drew a line. And it is not surprising then the next thing I did was a historical biography, because the evaluation of the individual was very high on my part. Interestingly enough, that was the time when historiography went into social history and the individual was downplayed. So I did something entirely out of fashion. That didn't bother me anyhow. It was a wonderful experience to write this biography. I loved the Italian archives. This was just wonderful. And I had to learn a lot, paleography, the demography, family studies. All of this plays in, because you have to deal in that biography. That lady who lived from 1472 to 1509 in Renaissance Italy. The politics, she was really at the mercy of the grand politics. But you had also to find out how she brushed her teeth, because she was supposedly had wonderful teeth in a time when people lost their teeth very, very early. So you have this range of interests you have to have. It was marvelous, marvelous experience. And I published my biography, and I was really, historiographically speaking, or historical theory, I was exactly where I was when I started the university. I didn't go, yes, I committed some historicist sins. I accepted lots of generalizations which I wasn't supposed to. And if it had been on my body, it would have been full of bandages, gadgets to somehow make sense out of it. Well, it was my colleagues who decided the thing for me, what I was going to do. Because they elected me to be their chair. A person who was in this audience told me on the way out, when I heard I was elected, he said, "Ernst, your life will never be the same." And he was right. I couldn't go to Italy. There was no time. I had a family, and I couldn't, in 4 weeks, I couldn't just have family vacation and the archives. So it was clear the Renaissance period was over for me. And I wrote a book as a kind of a bridge on Renaissance Europe, summarizing the new vision of the Renaissance which had emerged from the work of the generation I belong to. So, what I'm going to do, I remembered my dissertation field very fondly. And I hope all of you do, but I found out not really. I recalled how I wrote it. It was all through that, but the high point of writing came in the winter of 45 and 46. There was no heat in the room. There was very little to eat. I couldn't go any place. I had the University Library of Vienna and the National Library of Austria, which were fantastic libraries, but that's all I could use. But I enjoyed it enormously. It was the historiography, let's put it this way, how people wrote about the German Peasant War in 1525. And I really had a great education. I think that's what a dissertation should be, in the perspectives involved in history writing. And so I decided, why not take that up? And I have been in that for over 30 years now, enjoyed it enormously. I have gotten an insight into the doing history, as it was called by somebody, which is matchless, really. It's absolute, and it's a thrilling experience. I hope that some scholars will go, young scholars will go into it, because somehow or other, there's a a notion that the history of historiography is kind of a museum. You have stuffed historians lined up against the wall. In front of each of them, there's a little glass dish with their ideas in it. But it's so wrong. What you really experience is how life shaped history. How life shaped. You see, we're talking about teaching life, but life shapes us first. The great changes in historiography were not invented by academic historians, but they came in the context of life and were created to master life, to somehow make sense of it, and get a guide for living. So I was really struck when I studied historiography how much you can learn about history. There are many debates. I laugh sometimes because there comes up a new fashion in history. We do have fashions. And it's all new. But the fact is that when you go back, let's see, to the Renaissance, there was a debate on the same topic. But people don't read it. Well, what does people have to say to us? You're very much superior. Why? If you read the debates, you would doubt it. So historical theory has at its very core the retrospective of what history was written or told or recited. And from that we can learn the range of our topic, our endeavor, the historical endeavor. When I organized the historiography book, well, of course you organize it one after the other. That's how they came along. But I very soon realized there's something wrong with it, because this is making out of time a quasi-space. You put your little things one in a row there on a convenient imaginary row, and looks orderly, but it doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you anything except sequence. Where is the dynamic? The dynamics of life. Why? I noticed that we are in history studying the human condition in time. We say that and promptly forget about time. Time is not just a quasi-space in which we live nicely in a row. It's much more than that. And it is a dimension of life. It's not just another force of life. It is a dimension of life. It structures everything we do, everything we think. You think about it and you'll find that's what it does to you, to anybody. And there are two ways we can think about it. You don't even try to start saying, let's define time. Well, that's quite useless. I read a lot of this book, these other stuff which try to define time. I can recommend it as sleeping pills without side effects. But I cannot recommend it for starting to find out what time is. Time is, as we experience it in life, in two ways, in two modes: change and continuity. Change is very simply the experience that our contexts get different by the hour, by the minute sometimes. That's change, and we change along. You hear much about the quoted, I don't know whether you heard it, about Heraclitus, Greek thinker, that you cannot step with your leg in the same river twice. Now, I have tried to find that quote. I wasn't successful because I can't imagine that a so wise a thinker as Heraclitus was would be so sloppy. Because the quotation should be, you cannot step with the same foot in the same river at the, okay? Because that means you also are subject to time. And the river is time flowing. So, if that is so, then change is around us inevitably, relentlessly, endlessly. And what is continuity? In a sense, a weak sister, but very important for the human life. You have the institutions, Western Michigan. It's here, a world sturdy, seemingly permanent, has an enormous function in the process of living. But the fact is, all constructions of continuities are finite. I stood once facing the Grand Tetons, and I don't know whether any of you were out there. It's a fantastic experience. This huge stone walls rising, and you could have an imaginary dialogue. The rock saying, well, you miserable creature, you would live 80, 90 years, you know. Look at me, you know. Well, you could answer, what, give it 100 million years and you're going to see that you change too. The fact is everything changes. And continuity is what we construct. So, fine. What do we do with this in history now? That's the question. It's a rather broad principle which you must, when you think about history, more clearly define. Let's go back to Cicero. History, now translated properly, history, life's teacher. 3 nouns, standing there like statues. In a sense, denying there's no place for time in this. Well, try to translate it differently. History teaches life. Now you get action. You have a verb in there, see? At least you get a tense and time. But then you ask yourself, history teaches life. Who teaches history? Or what? Well, funny enough, I haven't found anybody asking that question. But it's a very important question. It really would then run, life teaches history and history teaches life. Now you find yourself together with Alice in Wonderland because that makes no sense, as you realize, because you ignore time. The life which teaches history is a different life than the life which history teaches. Something had gone on in between. You should really formulate this. That's very, very important. As life as once lived teaches life as being lived, and they teach life to be lived. Then you have the proper estimation and the proper recognition of time. Say, who cares? What? That nexus is the historical nexus. That's how anybody in his room and outside leads their life. That's what it is. It is this, you do it when you wake up in the morning. You remember the past. Otherwise you wouldn't know what's going on. You eventually decide in the present what you're going to do, whether you get up or not, and what you're going to do, and then you prepare for going away. Why do you go away? As a student, you want to go to class. You go to class because you want to be a medical doctor. See, you project in the future. That's the nexus we live by. And the historian must use that nexus to explain life, because that's the proper way to approach it. Now, fine. But that's not all of it. Because what happens is, in this projection business, when we project the future, we project this way. And life turns out this way. The actual future is rarely that what we project. There's a gap. It is this gap, this incompleteness, which is the sign of life, of human life. A gap which we love to get to close. The historian does that too. We want to create the perfect method in order to get the perfectly reconstructed history. There's a longing here to close the gap, a longing to have a final closure. Now, what are we going to do with this? This gets us very much into the situation of Sisyphus. I don't know whether he's familiar to you. If you don't know him, you're much better off. He was a very rude fellow. Many gods get mad of him in the Greek period. And so they condemned him to roll a boulder down in the underworld already. A roller up a steep hill, and when the boulder would not roll back, he would be released of that terrible chore. It so happens he rolls it up. Every time he puts it there, it rolls back. And he will do that. He's probably still rolling it according to the myth. And when we have a gap and it doesn't close, that seems to be very irritating. It's more than irritating. It makes us rather insecure. There is a longing in general for the closure. Expresses itself in human life in many ways. In history, it leads to something which is at first glance strange. In order to be sure that you have the right lesson of history, which will close the gap, you have to get some guidance from history. You have to get a lesson. This lesson has to be true in every context. You understand? Otherwise, it's a worthless lesson. The lesson of history must be solid. It must be, shockingly, timeless. Now, first of all, there is a real puzzle why in the world human beings think of timeless. There's nothing in the world which is timeless. How do you bring this up? How did it come in? We don't know. We don't know. I would say it's mystery. Now, the word mystery doesn't frighten me because Einstein used it a lot. So I cuddle up to him a bit here. It's strange, but we use it. So we can go to let's go back to Cicero. The last phrase was this. You remember his history is true, and it tells about the ages past and so forth. And by whose voice, other than the orator's, is it bequeathed to immortality? I prefer the word timeless. It comes out pretty much the doesn't have the baggage which immortality has. Well, most people, when you find quotations of that passage in Cicero, they leave all of that was always left out. The fact is that I ignored it, but I was young and not very bright then. Most historians, at most, we didn't get kind of upset because it says the orator has the job to make history more immortal. Well, it's a historian, of course, as you realize. Well, but there's a challenge in here. And that challenge is, Cicero described it, the challenge of the timelessness, which is in the concept of lesson. So the usefulness of history, strangely enough, depends that the lessons are timeless. That's very disquieting for some people. Well, let's see. Let's look into the historical accounts and see some lessons. Let's start with the ones with a small scope. There's first of all, the elevation of some people to the ideal person to emulate. That's still on the margin. Now, we have cautionary lessons. And I take most of them from Thucydides, but you can take other historians the same. Thucydides would say, before you start a war, be aware that wars happen to bring about dangerously unpredictable situations. Or, before you start a war, realize that increases internal tensions in a society. These are advisory lessons. You can follow them or not, but you're better off if you mind them. They do depict what is happening. Or you can use cold-blooded facts. I've never seen what it wants to express better. The powerless extract what they can. The powerful extract what they can. The powerless yield what they must. It's a very unpleasant lesson, but you could say, yes, it has a ring of truth in it, but of course we could try to change it. That's fine, but it doesn't say that it's not true. Now, these are the common type of lessons we are familiar with. It's the lesson which claims that it's true at any moment, anywhere. It is timeless. We don't call it timeless in history. We get uneasy with that stuff. Fine, we've encountered it now. We have to concede that much. Now come a different range of lessons. The best example is the so-called cyclical theory of history. It has as its core that any entity, empire, state, society, runs a course, a pattern which is timeless. Inception, ascendancy, peak, decadence, that's over. The fact is, unfortunately, it is true. It's true. You really take the organic cycle as your image. Now, we don't like that lesson. It's fate. Because what good does it to you that you know you live in the ascendancy of the culture? There's a famous, very famous scene described by Polybius. Scipio Aemilianus Africanus was a member of the famous Scipio family. He had done what the Romans wanted to do for over 200 years. He had defeated the Carthaginians. He had conquered the city of Carthage. And now he watched from an elevated place how the men were shipped into slavery, the women and children were driven out and resettled far away. The city was burned, the ruins carted off, the soil was plowed, and salt was strewn into the furrows. So it must be a place of devastation. Now, I can imagine a modern general sitting there and enjoy this stuff. I mean, with a Roman mindset, where it didn't matter that somebody was enslaved. Scipio sat there and became very sad. And what he said is recorded. What happened to Troy, what happened to the Persian Empire, what happened to the Medes, what happened to Alexander, all these empires come and go. And he very clearly understood that he was at the beginning of building the Roman Empire, and it will have the same fate as others. It's an enormously moving thing, because this man was standing in front of riches to be gained, of fame and everything. And here he's sad, because he projected in the cyclical theory the fate of Rome. As we, Western culture, you check, when did the cyclical theory of history get fashionable? It's always in periods where people think things are going kaput, that's it. Melancholy, malaise. Then they get suddenly popular, but not very long. Because they absolutely contradict the modern temper. Why? There was a fellow, by the way, Polybius, and I tell you that for a special reason, who had the audacity to think he can beat this. He had been very unhappy with the Greek city-states. They drifted up to fame and drifted down as fast as they were up. Very fickle. He was going to find out why. Why? He described in his cycles of government. It starts with monarchy. Monarchy has some good rulers. Eventually it descends into tyranny. Come some good souls, good people, aristocrats, they establish aristocracy. That goes down in a few generations into an oligarchy. Come the people, democracy. That goes down in the mob rule, and then it's all over. Now, then he said, how can I avoid that? And he looked at Rome, and he said, they have it. They discovered the recipe to avoid that. They have two consuls, powerful executive. At the same time, they have a senate with vice councillors. In the beginning, they were aristocrats, so to speak. And then comes the popular assembly. So you have the three possible forms, good forms of government, next to each other. And because they check and balance each other, that will make Rome immortal. Well, when he got older, he doubted it. Anyhow, it didn't work out that way, but Rome had a nice record. For centuries, they kept on top. Or if you take, for instance, the the pattern of modern revolutions. This enormous concentration of wish for change, which explodes. It goes a steep form of reforms, steep curve of reforms. Then suddenly it breaks a bit. Why? Because there were so many different people want to change, and a good many of them, the reforms did what they wanted, they went home. They decided, revolution is over, I got what I wanted. Then the true revolutionary gets very upset about this. There comes a short period of radical revolutions, but they are much too radical for the people who now have embraced continuity. And so the revolution settles at a new level of society and is over. So that's a pattern which very much the same. Mao Zedong tried desperately to keep the revolution alive with the Cultural Revolution, and it didn't work. Now comes probably the best illustration of what can happen. When something which is fairly reasonable, whether we like it or not, lessons are hardly comforting. The lessons of history, despite the fact that we want to have them, and then we don't follow them. What happened? There was an enormous battle in the field of historiography, in the broad picture, in the 20th century, fought out in the second half, after Second World War to the 1990s. It was the great battle between the core historiographical interpretation of modernity, progress, and postmodernism as its antagonist. Let's see what happened. Progress is a very much a Western view of time. It really started with a biblical time. What you have is a timeless period where God was alone. Then comes the creation and the fall. There comes the historical period. Then comes the end of the historical period in the apocalypse. And after that, a timeless period again. This is a very dynamic interpretation of time, because in the historical period, which really matters to us, there is a clear goal, a clear ending, and the promise of timelessness at the end. Now, come in modernity. That concept was shelved because the French enlightened thinkers were identifying timelessness with the Christian concept of heaven and so forth. They were mistaken in that, but they didn't know it. Not that they shelved Christianity, but timeless, the concept of the timelessness. The new image was that it begins with a kind of a period in which there's a dense fog in this whole thing. They didn't say dense fog, I say that. It was a fog of ignorance and superstition. And the historical period is the period where we clear this fog through reason. When you think of reason, please think of a reason with a capital R. It was a force, like Star Wars. You remember Star Wars? The Force. Yeah. The reason cleared this. And Marquis de Condorcet You have to admire the man. He wrote his 10 sketches of the 10 steps of man's human development at a time when he was on the run from the revolution. And he saw the fulfillment close. Instead of that, he was killed. What happens when perfect reason is established? Then you make projections for the future which have no gap. The actual and the projected future are the same. That means also that the present day is the same as tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Always intrigued me why people want to have this. When in 1945 the Red Army took over, and there was only one newspaper, that's what they published. It had 4 pages. And the first one was telling us what to do. The second and third were all kinds of stuff in Austria. And the fourth was a description of the life in the Soviet Union. And it went something like this. 5-line notices. Anna Nikolaevna in Novosibirsk found a new method to nail shoe soles to the shoe. And that heightened the production of shoes by so much. She was then, of course, declared a hero of labor and so forth. A whole page of these notices. That's what we were supposed to believe the life in the Soviet Union under communism is. Totally uneventful, no murder, nothing. It's just thinking of production. They also gave us films. I remember to one of them. It had a couple and a love story. But you remember it's a love story because you wouldn't know it. The boy lived with one collective farm and the girl the other collective farm. These collective farms feuded. Now, why they did this in the Soviet Union, where everybody was happy, I don't know. But the story is they sat in the evening at the riverside, the river which divided the collective farms, and talked about what every lover does. They talked about the egg production, the grain production. Then they said we could really devote our life to bringing these collective farms together. And that's what they did. And the movie showed how they then moved into the sunset, and they even held hands, even for the first time in the movie. Now, you see, the question is, what is it really happening if life is perfect? Nothing. Nothing can happen because, by definition, every change is a bad thing. Why? How do you get this? How can adult people figure that out? Why? The trick is simple. You see, change is only a sign of the historical period when you must change upward. But when you're there, you don't need change anymore. So you have eternal continuity, eternal timelessness. Now, what you did, you redefined blatantly, cavalierly, willy-nilly, the dimension of time to be having only one part. Change has served its purpose, is discarded. Why? That, you can call this what you want, but it is audacious, to say the least, and I would say foolish. That doesn't mean that the progress theory has to be shelved. It has to be modified for human purposes. May I point out to you that we have an ecology movement now. The ecology movement tells us something which the progress theory doesn't. that every step forward has consequences. And that consequences are negative, and a great impairment to the dream of the timeless. There is also an ethical thing. The Second World War, caused by some figuring, quite reputable, 60 million people, their lives, their health, their homes, they destroyed their cities. In the progress theory, you can rejoice that the forces which caused that are no longer there. But it is rather cavalierly to treat such a catastrophe as the Second World War as some kind of traffic accident towards perfection. So you heard a little bit of passion on that. So when we speak of progress, we must have a realistic picture of progress, that everything we do has consequences and not only positive ones. Well, there came a counterforce, like a hurricane. People who didn't just dislike progress, but hated it. And said it's all what you get for, because even the scientists are guilty of that. What happened? You must do something. You must, first of all, understand that you can never have absolute truth. And then they went further, is that you can't even have truth, period. Because that alone is the basis, the beginning. You must therefore remove all temptations to get knowledge of value and duration. Because that's where it starts. So the postmodernists said, we can never know reality. Reality is veiled from us, like the veil of Maya in the Indian mythology. We have no access to reality. All we have is stories about reality. Stories, language configurations, that's what we have. Because even our identity, what we are, is how we construct it by discourses. Now, history would be a collection of stories. I picture this vividly, going into my classroom, telling my students stories. And then a student gets up and said, I have a story too. Why, you say, sit down, you don't know enough. Why? He will say, how to come, since nobody knows actuality and reality, why in the world are you standing there, get paid to tell me a story, which is no better than yours? All right? Well, it didn't happen to me. But the fact is that that's the problem. And how was this accomplished? Well, you do the opposite from the progress theoreticians. You say, this illusions of absolute truth, absolute perfection, that has to go. And we can abolish it. We can abolish it by simply abolishing continuity. So let us ban continuity and affirm change, relentless change. It's also interesting that one great reformer of a great country Mao Zedong, had the same idea. When the revolution somehow settled down, that made him very uncomfortable. So what he said is, he made the Cultural Revolution, which was really meant to be a permanent revolution. It's a dream. It's a dream of the change, of change as the only dimension of life for the human being. An illusion. Now what do we learn from that? What we learn from that is that the timeless, we can accept timelessness in small doses, in lessons for the individual life or for our state to govern itself. We must face the fact that if we go further, for instance, we want to discover the laws which govern history so that we completely know what happens. We freeze ourselves in. If we are governed by laws left and right, the only lesson we learn is that we can't do anything about it, because otherwise there wouldn't be laws of history. And if we then be even more audacious and try to simply get what we want, simply think around with time, pretend there is only change, or pretend there is only continuity, we court disaster. And that's the practical side of this. This, if you want to change with one conjurer's trick the human condition, you run into catastrophe, because you would try something which just cannot be done. So when the historian steps back and says, what do we do then? How is history useful? The original question I asked when I was a young boy. We are the persons who paint a panorama of the reality of life over thousands of years. Yes, we make mistakes. Yes, it's incomplete. Yes, it's sometimes mistaken. That doesn't matter. That's the best we have. There's nothing better. If we try to do what some people tried to do here in the 20th century, the progress theory in the form of Marxism was a catastrophe. It was an illusion. Hitler's concept of the race established a sort of happy mankind where one rules and one is shut up, was an illusion. The historian must be the great destroyer of illusions, because illusions are too dangerous when they masquerade as history or anything else. That's insight of the limit and the value of usefulness of history. That's probably the most important lesson we learn. Thank you. We can have questions.
Ernst, thank you for helping us see our own craft on the timeline of history. Thank you so much for this.
You're welcome.
We have a few minutes for some questions and discussion.
I cannot tell you what the political alignment of my professors were in the gymnasium. I knew a little bit about it at the university. One of my problems was that I wanted to find out what sense does this history make which I live through. Do you know, when I left Austria, nobody had written a book on that history from 1918 to the present, because It was too dangerous. It was too dangerous. And so to come back, it was a dangerous place. So you learned discretion. And many of these people were very well formed. Some were very devout Catholics, some were socialists, crypto-socialists. One was even a very prominent Nazi. By the way, it's hard for me to call it Nazi because in the German language we have High German, jargon, dialect, slang, and Nazi slang in Germany. It used to be slang in the 30s. And so I was drilled by my parents, don't you talk slang, because that, the class structure and all of that. Anyhow, one was a fairly prominent Nazi. And I took a seminar from him. And there were 8 people in it. 7 women and 1 man. That was me. I was a ratio at the university at that time. Sea of women with few men. And he started explaining how dictatorships work. Very clearly meaning Hitler. He had a very interesting example. He said, you have to move people, constantly occupy them. Don't let them sit down and think. That's dangerous. It's like boiling milk on a stove. You have to stir it constantly, because if it burns in one spot, you have lost. You see, because it flavors the whole milk in a bad way. I was absolutely astonished to hear this from this man. Another time he comes in into the auditorium maximum, 500-600 people, and there were swastika flags there. Gets to the podium and said, what do those rags do here? This is a lecture hall and not an assembly hall. You wouldn't get a law out from under that without being severely punished, but he could do it because he had this portfolio. You see, it's very difficult to say. These professors very happily cited historicism. And that made them very good professors because they were not influenced by any ideology. There was a very proper school of history which you could use as a shield. After the war, the same professors were castigated because they were told that historicism was a cover for cowardice and unethical behavior. Why? If you lived through that period, you were much more forgiving than somebody who sits at a desk 20 years later. But I can truly say I had no professor at the Realgymnasium or at the university whom I've thought about it a good deal, can convict of even a lapse into ideology. We had a professor in Roman history, tremendous scholar. Why? He was sympathizing with the Anschluss, but not because he liked Hitler or anything, because he believed only large states, powerful states, matter. He read that out of the history of the Roman Empire, not from Hitler's proclamations. So I can say, I wish I would, that was a tragedy, this particular professor. There was an air raid on the city. And one of the bombs hit part of the university building. At 4 o'clock, we gathered for Vorlesung, which means class. The professor was sitting there with a candle. We sat there just listening. There was dust all over the place, and it smelled after burning. And he lectured on the Renaissance, as a matter of fact. In the middle of the lecture, he got up and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, under these circumstances, I cannot read on." And he left. Somehow or other, the will to live and teach had left him. He had briefly collaborated with Hitler after 1938, was a prominent Roman Catholic, regretted it. He was left there in that position. The SS fulminated against him in many of its publications. So there were tragedies, there was a deep human dilemma. Do you speak out, lose your job, go to concentration camp, or do you simply go to be a historicist, which was easier? Well, I was very happy to come here, and I must say I'm still happy. Yes, it's a great cultural clash. Things which moved me didn't move people surrounded me. I didn't think exactly alike. Many of the problems I had didn't really touch a person born in Michigan or in Ohio or so. It doesn't somehow register. And I don't blame them. It was lovely to have people who weren't really in the same mess I was before, you see. I had an interesting experience when I studied existentialism, and I gave some lectures on it. A lady got up and said, I had talked about the life which struggles to find some meaning. And she was a very nice lady. She said, well, Mr. Breisach, we in America don't do that. It was a very sweet comment, but it somehow describes my situation, you see. In history, too, there was, when I came, there was a very prominent historiographical school, the Consensus School. It goes something like this. America came to great power. After all, America had just become a superpower. Because there's a principle of unity in it. The principle of unity is common experience of a special kind, common ideas of a special kind. They, in their unfolding, made America great. Well, for a historicist who comes from Europe, that's nice to hear that, as a historicist interpretation of America. But then I was absolutely stunned when I found, of course, that how powerful the progress theory is in this country. It's not a theory, it's a practice of life. A inner conviction, which I envy people that they have it. I can't simply go along with it. Oh, in the measured progress, I said, yes, that's fine. But with all kinds of warnings. Then, what happened? In great ingenuity, this historicist conviction was transplanted into progress. The idea that the exceptional nation is the driving force of progress, while the historicist would be embarrassed because that makes out of the specific American experience a general experience, a universal one. Of course, that's, as you realize, is quite familiar to people. How you can mix the two, I'm not quite sure about that yet. But these things, you know, startling things, you have when you come from one culture into the other. And I'm very glad that I kept a good deal of my training as it is. and didn't just simply fade in the wallpaper. It makes it more interesting. Any other question? Why, I take this as a great compliment that I converted all of you. After all, I tried to tell you not to have illusions, and as historians know, that history should be a destroyer of illusions. I can have a small one myself. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much for a stimulating afternoon.